So we thought we would actually start this off a little bit by recapping a little bit kind of how we got here and go over a little bit about some of the studies that have gone on here in this last year. Over the next couple days, we'll go over this, and then we've invited Lisa Lazarus, who works for the thoroughbred racing, horse racing, so HISA, right? So thing that we talked about last year a lot. And she's going to describe that whole process, where it came, what's happening with it, and hopefully where it's going. And then we're going to take a little bit of a break, yeah, and then come back in and have a little bit more of a talk just about, where we want to go, raising the bar with what we want to do, not just with horse welfare, but what does that mean and how do we apply it in and out of the competition ring. So that's basically what the program is going to be. So I thought we would start today with, again, kind of what we talked a little bit, and we'll go through it quite quickly. It won't be as extensive as it was last time. But if you remember last year, the FEI put together a commission, a worldwide commission, and over the last 2.5 years, or 3 years, they've been studying this, sent out surveys. They've sent out surveys again afterwards, the second round, and that is what Cami Haleski, who is our hometown Lexington, UK professor that is actually on that commission. She's going to talk to us tomorrow morning about what the second level of this is. This is still kind of just going over what the first level is. So when we talk about welfare, that is where it got driven. It's a very, very big thing in Europe, right? The EEF, the European Equestrian Federation, has been going down this road for a long time. So as we started this conversation, I think it's had a pretty big effect. So social license, and this is, how many of you going throughout this year have had conversations in your environments, right? At your shows, at your places, that people start talking about this social license thing. So quite a lot. So it's had an effect, right? And really when we get down to it, the effect is for us to make sure that we're paying attention. And how do we deal with it? Because in the end, the public is going to have an opinion, especially for anyone that sells a ticket, any place that sells a ticket, because you're selling a ticket, and then that person is going to decide what they want to see or have an influence about what they want to see. So the social license is basically really rests with the public. It's basically an acceptance of your activity, that they want to make sure that there's 3 parts to this, 2 parts that lead to the third part, is that the organization is paying attention to it, right? The regulatory side is paying attention to it. The organizers, the athletes, they're paying attention to what this aspect is. So if they feel like you're paying attention to it, you build credibility with it. That you feel and you have accepted that this is part of the program. We were invited a month ago, the USEF was invited a month ago to go for the US Army. So the US Army has gotten a little bit in trouble with their caissons program. Their caissons program is the one that does the funerals, right? It's at Arlington Cemetery, and the presidential funerals, of which they're really panicked about right now because President Carter is 98, isn't he? So they invited us to come in and talk about this, and we gave this presentation, this social license presentation, and helped them through. Tracy was there. That we talked a lot about just the aspect of what they do, how they could do it different, how they could make sure that they're within a horseman's concept. But really, it was wonderful that actually they reached out to the USEF to come help them. Okay, and not just any other organization, but they reached out to us. We went down, had a very, very good meeting, and it seems to be ongoing. Admiral Kreitz, is he here? He might be next door in the LO. He was the one that really kind of drove it and got us there, and it was a good conversation. So I said to them, you've already crossed the bridge. Because they were saying, no, we don't know what we're talking about, we don't know where we are. And I said, you've already made the first decision, that's the hardest decision. It's actually crossing the bridge to say, actually, there is an issue. right? Whatever that issue is and how we do it, how we deal with it, that's separate. But crossing the first bridge to say that we are not isolated, I think is a really important side of it, and I do believe that we've crossed that bridge. So the organization part is a credibility to bring that trust that from every aspect of the horse world, there is a relationship that is now 2A that identifies what issues are, says what issues are you trying to deal with some of them, and also then educate a little bit about what you can do about it and what those issues are as they've changed over, especially in this last 100 years. And as with that leads to that, the public to be able to say that we believe that they are trying to do the right thing, right? Now, it's a never-ending process. You never have it. It's never going away. I remember a long time ago being part of the eventing thing, and I was on a commission that they went around for safety for eventing, because our sport's changed quite a lot of it. We use frangible technology now. We use a lot more brush. We do a lot of these things that have had a huge difference, right, of reducing horse falls and injury rates, and I mean by 70% in some places. So it's made an impact. But we were in there with Jackie Stewart. Everybody know Jackie Stewart, the Grand Prix rider? I'm a Grand Prix racing driver. Right, and he said, he was a big safety guy, and he said, basically, you're never going to stop. You're going to think of something 20 years in that you had no clue of why you didn't think about that 20 years, because it seems so obvious. And then he also says that if you have the technology and you have that ability, you have to use it. You don't have a choice, because everybody knows about it. So again, what is a social license to operate? The unwritten social contract between the public accepting whatever endeavor is. It didn't come out of horses. It didn't come out of sport. It actually came out of mining and the forestry industry, right? You're going to take away my mountain. Do I believe that that's going to be good for my community, right? Even you promise that you're going to put most of my mountain back. That's really kind of where it all started. So we all want to make sure that we want to strengthen our social license. That includes sustainability, integrity, safety, doping, all of these things that we are paying attention to. And the interesting thing is that obviously the equestrian side, it is in the public environment, it's more emotive, right? It is about emotion. And we sell emotion. You got the pictures that you just watched in that. Because it's emotional to us, that emotion can be transferred over to the public, and so it is emotive. Well, that emotive side can work both ways, right? So especially with the most dangerous tool, I'm not going to take this away from you. The most dangerous tool that you have in the world is this, because everybody is a journalist. And whether that's in context or out of context doesn't really make any difference. We'll talk a bit about that a bit later. But in the end, that becomes a dangerous tool because images can be brought forward, again, in or out of context at different times. So the risk of us doing that, right? So you have to make sure that all animals are coming under the spotlight. If you think about, we don't have animals in circuses, right? And you think about SeaWorld, and you think about gray round racing is now, illegal in 45 states out of now. Jump racing is now out of Australia. So there is, all around the world, right, there are different ways where equestrians, just sport, that uses horses or entertainment that uses horses are becoming under the spotlight, and the society doesn't really distinguish one from the other. So when something happens in racing, it does affect us. Something happens in rodeo, it does affect us. Something that does happen in polo, it affects us, and vice versa. So they don't distinguish overall the one sport to the other, it is just horses as a whole. Okay, in the context, and this is one thing that I really believe, is that they don't distinguish between species, all animals and all that kind of stuff, but a lot of times the public doesn't come in with the negative attitude. And only through the image or social media or something like that can their opinion be turned where they didn't start with that. Now there are people who are going to start with that. no question. But there's a lot of people that are quite neutral, right? And then they can be turned one way or another in some argument or some thought process or some that is going on. So, but the public will prioritize, really, in that side, the uneducated side, right? Uneducated when I mean uneducated in horses or even uneducated in animals, right? That they'll prioritize the emotion over the evidence. And so the logical argument doesn't always get you there. So these are just examples of the things that have happened. One of the biggest things that happened a while ago was last year in the 3 years now ago in the Olympic Games in Hong Kong in Tokyo with pentathlon, right? Whether you agreed with it or not, what happened, right? It had a huge effect and it went viral in a heartbeat. And suddenly, pentathlon was really out of the Olympic Games. And now they have changed, so now they don't use horses in modern pentathlon after this Games in Paris. It's the last time that we do it. And their thing is they turned it into an obstacle course as the fifth one. And it looks like they're actually going to be able to stay in LA. But these are all of these ideas, right? Racing rules, what's happening, very much in a forefront of, as Lisa will bring to us, what's in the forefront of racing's minds. Okay, so, and we have a thing that I know we've dealt with in Olympic sports quite a bit, is that in the end, you are told to change or you're going to get changed, right? So you're going to get changed by an organization that doesn't know as much about what you're doing as what you do, right? And they don't, most of the time I would see what Lisa says, but a lot of times they don't want to do that, right? But they're forced into it, right? And they're forced into it through the legislation and the public opinion and of how we're going to go from that, right? So the more that we know in this research, right, the more that we know about welfare, it really changes. You can think about even practices that were part of our sports, part of our just dealing with animals. So 80 years ago, everybody would have seen a horse every day of their lives. Whether you were in a city or whether you're in an urban environment, you would have seen a horse every day. Here, now you will go around and people will have never seen a horse ever, okay? And they'll see it on TV, and then suddenly they're going to want to ask questions because they're not around it all the time, and they ask questions of how is it taken care of, what are you doing with it, da-da-da-da, and you have to have that ability to answer it. Okay, so the social license in our world, okay, as we principles that we go forward, right, is that the appreciation that horses are sentient creatures, which means that they feel emotion, okay, different from ours, but they definitely feel emotion. The horses should have an agency. The agreement that the horse welfare is the highest priority is something that all horse organizations have to be a part of, and that we have policies and practice that influence that. The continued use of horses relies on, in sport especially, and entertainment, really relies on the public's acceptance of that, right? Not just in your backyard, which we'll talk about later on this afternoon. Professional development for all of us, and a zero tolerance for any activity that has a negative influence, okay, certainly in the health and welfare side of the equation. So the typical thing, and you hear, how many people have heard out there, well, that's just a bunch of people that don't know what they're talking about. Right? Happens all the time, right? And unfortunately, it's not an answer that we can answer, right? It is not an argument that we can argue. That's the emotive side of it. So we have to make sure that our arguments are in a whole. There is a logical side. There is an emotive side. There is certainly a horse, and defending and making sure that the horse welfare sides are very, very strong. So which one is it? Are we seriously in trouble? Are we kind of in trouble? Are we not in trouble at all because you don't want to pay attention? And I think what we felt over this year is that we're not really in trouble, but we have to be ahead of the game. We have to think ahead of the game. right, in so many different ways, from so many different aspects, so that we don't get into the place where the iceberg melts around us. So the survey, just part of the survey is, who were they? Okay, and there were 14,000 respondents from around the world. One-third of them didn't have anything to do with the horses, just half, they've had some experience. 20%, kind of just under 20% recent experience, and then the rest of them are kind of the people that have horses at home, professionals, but they deal with horses all the time. So that is the group that we looked at. And then, which one of the following statements regarding the welfare of horses used in sport you must agree? Do they think that we're doing a good job? Do they think the welfare standards are high? Only 1/3 of the group does. Right? We believe 50% of the people that are in this group, this 14,000 people, think that the welfare standards need improving in their own way. And then getting into some more surprising things. Which statements you most agree with? So again, 78% as a total, okay, are ones that they think that the welfare standards need improving. Now I would say that even in this room, we could probably have 70% of the people thinking some side of the welfare needs improving, okay? So again, not in that the iceberg is melting, you're in trouble, but it's something to pay attention to. So what are they interested in? So really 60% of it was how their well-being and how they're treated, and horse safety. Those are the first two big things, right, in all aspects that you feel, almost 70%. That is the main thing. Human safety, that's way down. Environment and how much money and that's all different, right? But the two things about how the horse is being taken care of, right, and what's their safety aspect. And this is always the slide that I think is personally the most interesting. So the public, so not somebody that has to deal with horses. Do you think that horses enjoy being used in sport? And 67% of them said no. The one that surprises me is the other one. So those are the people that are in the sport and have horses. And 50% of the people say that we don't think that horses enjoy what they're doing. I happen to come from the place where I don't believe that. I'm in the orange. Okay? And I think a lot of us as horse people, especially in this room, would probably say that, right? But there have heard, even as what we heard last year, there were people that said, I wonder. But I thought that really surprised me. It was a 50-50 deal that even internally horse people themselves a lot of times don't feel that horses enjoy it. Okay? And these are these categories. The first thing that the general public talked about is, what are the other 23 hours when he's not being ridden, right, or taken care of, right? So this is actually a thing that we just wrote a thing out to California, right, to Golden State, right, track, where we just wrote a letter yesterday talking about, the other 23 hours, right, and how that is and how that can be kind of misconstrued. Tack and equipment, training and riding practices, physical stress and injuries, those are all the top ones, okay, coming all the way down to stress in competition for horses at the bottom. So the 6 main categories that you end up talking about is at the top: training and riding, tack and equipment, recognizing physical and emotional stress, accountability, enforcement, and knowledge, the other 23 hours, competitive drive, horses as an object. Yeah, are they a motorcycle, or are they a sentient creature? Okay, not fit to compete, right? Thinking about a horse's welfare and masking things where you're going to compete them anyway. So those are the really 6 big categories that we end up talking about. And this is just an interesting thing just from a media coverage. How much does the media itself influences people's opinion? And I don't know, Cammie, I'll be interested in your aspect with this for tomorrow when you speak about the difference between social media or is this public media, right? Is this like television, magazines, that side of the media, or is it also social media? Okay. Right, so I think that would be be interesting as a secondary question, because that kind of surprised me. Is that they say that media doesn't, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in the media that you end up talking about it. So just we're talking about professional media or social media. Okay, and then really, as we go through here, what would you like to see more about or improve, right? Daily care, what happens to horses when they leave the sport was actually what happens when they retire, which is obviously a huge thing for racing, or some of the sports where the younger horses are the strongest side of their sport compared to sports that where their horses compete into their later ages. How the horse is trained, and what do they get to do in their free time when we talk about that forage and freedom side of the equation. And then this is just kind of the typical grief pattern that everybody talks about, right? Like, do you deny it? You say there's nothing wrong, and then probably where we are, we're like, okay, recognize it, and how do we make some changes, and how do we make it work, but you're not in trouble? How can we make this work? And then suddenly you get into the place where you're off and going. But I think that is cyclical all the time, right? I think it's very, very important that we all understand that this is not a one-off, right? This is the life that we are living in, and it's only going to get more interesting and more scrutinized in different places as we go forward and we do things. And so when we talk about what do we need to do, we need to make sure, as we have started to talk about, and we're getting now into actions, okay, in a big ship, which I'll talk about later, the USEF, or FEI, or whatever. Ships are hard to turn, right? They take a while. So we have to make sure that it always is in the forefront of our mind and a forefront of our mission statements. Understand the responsibility of words. Words matter. Especially in the public domain, words matter, and actions matter, right? Are you changing, and you're showing that you're doing things and you're getting changes and results? And then make sure that we look to engage and have that conversation, and not being afraid to have that conversation and sit a little bit in our own barn. Okay, well, they don't get it, right? And so because they don't get it, I'm just going to leave them alone. And as you know, that with any kid, you leave them alone and suddenly let's, and that's exactly the same type of thing that happens, right? You have to engage, and we have to be willing to talk about it. What those actions are, all to be determined really by you, okay? And that thought process to make sure that we have that commitment, that we are willing to listen, we're willing to see, we're willing to hear, we're willing to then take that and balance it into the world so that it's a better place, not just for us, but for horses. So as I said the other day, or last year, right, that we get to the place where we're not always in a defensive mode, but we're in a place where we're in a celebratory mode. Do we celebrate horse sports everywhere we go? And not just always be in the place where we're in the defensive side, okay, of what we do. So I think it's very, very important as we go forward to make sure that we are not just putting it on the side and we'll just leave it for somebody else. But there are actions. Doesn't mean that we're flipping all the sports around, right? Doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to ride horses. Doesn't mean we're not going to be able to jump horses. Doesn't mean we're not going to be able to race horses or do whatever. But are there things that are important to the community that our core values stay true? Because those are the 5 questions that we sent out. What are your core values? So no matter what changes, these things are us. That as long as it's not a welfare side, right? And yeah, we could adjust over here. Yeah, we could adjust over here. We could adjust over here. But these core things are the things that we believe in, right? Which I would hope would be that communication between horses and humans. That's got to be just absolute number one expression, I think, of a core value that people understand and that we're trying to get across. So I thought we would just go over, recap a little bit where we were last year. I want to invite Lisa up to come up and figure out this computer. Lisa Lazarus, we met each other 20 years ago, I guess now. She was legal director for the NFL for a while, or one of the directors for NFL. Came and worked for the FEI, was a legal director there. Came back to the States. I remember sitting in Lausanne on the train station telling me that you were moving back to New York because her husband wanted to move back to New York. And now works for HISA, okay, the Horse Integrity Sports Act that got passed. Is that right?
Horse Racing Integrity.
The horse, yeah, it's an acronym, right? So, and that's what she's been dealing with in the last couple of years, so I think it would be great to welcome her, number one. Thank you very much for coming. So, and hear your experiences, and you're on that.
Well, I'll start with the good news in that I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. So, I have long stuck with my hypothesis that I'm typically better without one. So it's really terrific to be here. I started my career in the horse world in sport horses, and David was one of the very first people that I met, so it does feel a little bit like old home week. Just focusing on this question of the social license to operate. I first encountered it back in 2009. I had left the National Football League after 10 years as an in-house lawyer, primarily working on player disciplinary issues and the anti-doping program. And I had moved to Geneva, Switzerland with my husband for actually his job. And I saw an advertisement for a general counsel position in a mid-size governing body, looking for someone to do very similar things that I've been doing at the NFL. And so I applied. I later found out that this was not a sport that involved only one athlete. It was a dual athlete sport. And that was really my kind of introduction into the very complicated questions, I think, that do surround a sport that involves an animal. And in particular, at that time, one of the reasons why I was hired is that the FEI was really facing its own sort of crisis with regards to the social license. It was right after the Beijing Olympic Games where 6 horses had tested positive for a prohibited substance, and the public had really, internationally had quite a negative reaction to that, as you can imagine. And the IOC in particular was putting a lot of pressure on the FEI to reform and to look seriously into these questions. The international community was, concerned, like we sort of hear today, history really does repeat itself, that animals were being, used unfairly for sport, that horses were being drugged, and didn't understand a lot of what all those of us in the room understand about how horse sport operates and the differences between, obviously, medication and doping. And in preparing for today, I sort of went back and looked at some of the media reports from that time, and it was, eerie to me how similar a lot of the questions and concerns were. There was an article back in the New York Times, and at the time, the FEI, we commissioned 2 studies. One was led by Lord Stevens, who had worked who was the head of the police in London and had actually been in charge of the inquest into Princess Diana's death. And the other was Arne Lundquist, who was the vice president of the WADA at the time, the World Anti-Doping Agency. And what he famously said was that the humans can decide what to do and what not to do, but the horse is a victim of what is done to it by the people. That was, a little bit novel at that point in time. The discussion hadn't really been at the forefront in horse sports prior to that. And it was really a moment of reckoning for the FEI and subsequently for the 133 national federations at the time. So the FEI wanted to act, wanted to do what, sort of the research tells us we need to do in these situations, which is to really reform and to make changes. And so we sort of embarked on this process of looking at, one, the anti-doping rules, two, how the laboratories were operating, what medications should and should not be prohibited in a horse. And it was a very kind of intense period, and David was involved at the time, and Sonia Keating, who may not be in the room now, but who I've worked closely with over the years, was also involved. And there were a number of sort of conclusions reached, and from that came, very significant change. And it was a difficult period of adjustment for a number of the federations, particularly those who had not been used to as rigorous rules. And that took education, and it took, a focus on really explaining to industry stakeholders why it matters and why the public's perception of the sport matters. So sort of fast forward to, sort of 15 years later, really 13 years later, and you have, David was kind enough to sort of put together all of our, most wonderful highlights in racing on that one slide. So fast forward to Santa Anita, and, we have a very difficult racing season where the weather had been terrible, there were a number of forces that came into play, but nonetheless, a very significant number of horses broke down. And in horse racing, that is really the sort of first, second, and third most challenging, most concerning aspect of our sport that we have to be incredibly committed to addressing. So, and then following that, which was not, sorry, I think I'm touching David's I said I didn't have a PowerPoint, but nonetheless I am. It's fine, as long as it's close. So the Santa Anita sort of crisis had begun, and then following that, in March of 2020, were the arrests of about 29 both thoroughbred and standardbred trainers for what was essentially a significant doping enterprise in horse racing, misbranding of medications. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but things really went from bad to worse for horse racing. And it really was a moment in time where horse racing had to sort of confront, and Alex Waldrop, I know, was here, for those of you that were here last year. He spoke a lot about this, and I listened to it before my remarks today, and I know that he sort of took those of you that were here through the history, but that was the moment in time, and the Washington Post ran an article that said, "Has horse racing outlived its time?" And sometimes you have to sort of hit rock bottom for real change to happen, but fortunately, the catalyst for change was Senator Mitch McConnell, who was the majority leader at the time, saw the article, Kentucky obviously being a very important jurisdiction for horse racing. He realized that it was genuinely the time for action. And for a number of years, probably since about 2012, there had been this federal bill kind of bopping around through various channels in Washington called the Horse Racing Integrity Act. And the hope was that this bill, which had a number of supporters in horse racing, the Jockey Club, the Breeders' Club, the NTRA, that it would get some traction, and and USADA was involved, and it would at least be, we'd be able to get one national program for anti-doping. I mean, the USAF has been around for more than 100 years. Horse racing has had a national governing body for just short of 2 years. So you can only imagine what it's like to try to govern an industry when you've got 30 different racing jurisdictions doing different things. So this act was in the pipeline, and it was at that moment, and just going back also to the talk last year, I also listened to Rolly Owers, who I know well also from my FEI time, and he said, if you can't self-regulate, government will do it for you. Well, that's essentially what happened in thoroughbred horse racing. So Mitch McConnell sort of took the baton and worked with Senator Schumer, and there were 230 co-sponsors on the bill, which eventually became the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act. So safety was introduced because when stakeholders got together and they really looked at what the act that had been kind of drafted before and was working its way through the process, that the two sort of foci should really be integrity with regards to anti-doping and safety, and that safety was going to be a really important component. So The Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act passed at the end of 2020. It did not actually launch its racetrack safety program until 2022. The board was constituted. I mean, this was literally like building a governing body from scratch. I mean, you know, my experience with the FEI, knowing how the USCF operates, I mean, there are committees and processes and groups and staff, and you know, we had none of that. I was hired as the first CEO in February of 2022, and we launched the racetrack safety program in July of 2022. And sort of going back to the title of this sort of talk about the social license to operate, you know, this was horse racing both being, you know, obviously being pushed by the federal government, but also a lot of forces within it wanting that regulation and really doing what it could to act. And so we launched the racetrack safety program in July of 2022, and one of the first, you know, there were a number of things that were in the racetrack safety program. Racetrack accreditations, you know, significant veterinary protocols, regulations around, you know, what jockeys can and can't do. And one of the rules that I think is sort of interesting to talk about and fits really well into this social license discussion was the crop rule, the use of the whip. And I think also Dr. Helsinki mentioned this as well in her remarks last year, which is that, you know, folks who work in horse racing, trainers, jockeys, they don't think of the whip as a horse welfare issue. Like for them, it's very low on the spectrum. You know, right now, the way our regulations require the whip to be almost like styrofoam. So if you sort of hit yourself with it, you generally don't feel it. It really is, even for a human, not a sort of significant act, so to speak. But the public hates it. I mean, they perceive it as, you know, horse abuse. And it was something that, even if internal stakeholders didn't understand, we knew was really important for us to regulate. And nonetheless, you know, if you're good horse management, good riding, you don't need to be using the crop significantly. And, you know, our hope is that primarily riders use it for safety. But the rule that we ultimately came out with after a lot of research and a lot of internal discussions and stakeholder discussions was, you know, there was a maximum of 6 strikes, and you'd have to wait. The horse, you could have 2 strikes, and the horse had to react 2 strides, and you could strike again, but for a total of 6. And that was, you know, a compromise rule that really nobody liked, which was sort of a sign that it was probably the right place to land. But what was particularly interesting about it is that we were the first jurisdiction to mandate the loss of purse, so giving back prize money, if you use the crop more than 3 times above, so actually 10 times or more. And we had, I mean, you can imagine the reaction in the industry to that. I mean, you would have thought we would take in everyone's like firstborn. It was really very, very emotional, you know, sort of negative reaction, not from everyone, but from a lot of folks who are in the industry. And, you know, the reason why the committee that was in charge of these rules and HISA in general sort of, you know, took that step after a lot of discussion and consultation is that if you want to make a real change, you have to change the culture. And if the only stakeholder that sort of suffers from the use of the crop is the jockey, and the jockey in our sport is not necessarily or always the one with the most resources or the most power, then you're not going to make change. So by essentially sanctioning the owner, we got another important stakeholder involved in trying to make change. So we'd heard anecdotally from some jockeys that some owners might say to them, don't worry about a few extra strikes, we'll just pay the fine, because the fines were not that significant prior to HISA. And so that was a really important, we thought, sort of cultural, social license change to make. And the interesting thing is, you know, 2 years ago when we first came out with it, as I said, there was a lot of negativity around it. No one talks about it anymore. It's just part of the landscape. It's settled. It's, you know, everything is sort of right-sized. We're down to hardly any violations. You know, we first started, it was maybe about 4 or 5 per 1,000 starts. Now we're at 0.01. So really, you know, it shows that sometimes you've got to be a bit brave, as long as you feel certain about your commitment and the change that you're making, because change is hard, especially for industries that have been around forever, and sometimes the negativity may come even without the opportunity to test things out. Now, if it hadn't brought about the change that we wanted, we would have looked at it again. You know, not necessarily everything is going to always work, but in that case, that was really the experience that we had with that rule. Sort of moving on, so as I said, July 2022, we launched the Racetrack Safety Program, and less than a year later, we had the Kentucky Derby of May 23, well, just last year. You know, I was, probably not surprisingly, I was not drinking mint juleps and hanging out with my family during the Kentucky Derby this year. That was a very difficult day for horse racing. We all know that fatalities happen. We all know we try to avoid them. Anybody in the industry knows how much trainers and owners love their horses, and it's the last thing in the world they want. But one of the most difficult things to experience as an industry is to have your kind of worst case scenario happen in your most significant moment of the year. I mean, if you ask 100 people about horse racing, you know, I would say 99 will know the Kentucky Derby, and they may know nothing else if they're not in the industry, but that is the moment when all of, when eyes are really on horse racing. And so that was, you know, even a more sober reminder to us about the social license. And you know, we suddenly, and I personally had to deal with an incredible amount of international media and questions like, what were we doing? And so fortunately, HISA was well positioned to talk about what we actually were doing and to make sure that we could really sort of double down on those efforts. So maybe I'm just going to speak a little bit about what we have done and what we are continuing to do to try to address to try to address ultimately the underlying safety and integrity issues that we obviously want to improve in our sport, but to simultaneously deal with the social license question. So, you know, we started, as I said, with like a blank piece of paper. So the first thing that we had to do was get our stakeholders just registered with HISA. And that's, you know, we're governed by the law itself, and that was one of the requirements of the law, is that every trainer, every jockey, every owner has to be registered with HISA and have a HISA number. And so just that in and of itself was you know, sort of an interesting time for us when we first launched. And, you know, a lot of our participants are not really familiar with electronics, with computers, with sort of doing things online. A lot of flip phones in horse racing, I've come to learn. So we spent an inordinate amount of time. We now have 55,000 horses and 32,000 people registered. You know, through that process, we had 90,000 calls to our help desk. So, and I have Tracy Gilman here in the room somewhere who works with HISA, and she is one of those super duper help desk people who help to get people registered and answered questions. And we have a really dedicated team. But even something like so fundamental as that was really sort of a big step forward for us. We have 900 veterinarians in the portal, and we also started our accreditation process, because one of the kind of perspectives of HISA is that every stakeholder in the industry has to participate in improving things. It's like an all hands on deck philosophy. So it's not just trainers, it's not just jockeys, it's also racetracks who have to contribute to, you know, developing and providing safe environments. So we look at services, we look at facilities, we look at the receiving barns, we look at their in and out security measures, all of those things that contribute to providing a safe environment. You know, I read a book recently that talked about the importance of making just very, very small changes. And if you make a lot of very small changes over a cross-section of sort of categories or activities, you have the benefit of ultimately seeing bigger changes. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that we're leaving no stone unturned, particularly in our accreditations. We have 51 tracks that fall under HISA authority. So just to put that in context, HISA is a federal law, and so we only can regulate activities that sort of touch on interstate commerce. So a precondition to being under HISA's jurisdiction is exporting the signal for pari-mutuel wagering. So if you don't simulcast, you're not under HISA's jurisdiction. So there are a number of tracks that don't simulcast, and then we have a couple of states, West Virginia and Louisiana, that have sued HISA, and so we're currently in litigation with them, and during that time, we're not operating there. And so we've been able to, in our first year, accredit 21 tracks, and they'll be the other 31 will happen this year. We have an incredible opportunity with the data that we're collecting. For the first time, stakeholders are obligated legally to provide us with a certain amount of data. It's anonymized, and it's not to sort of go after anybody for any malfeasance in this regard, but it's to try to understand, what's working, what isn't working, risk factors. And so we have over 2 million veterinary records in our portal just since July of 2022. We're working with companies like Palantir and Amazon Web Services to really harvest that data to kind of give back to the industry to help drive better safety practices, better training practices. We also, I think for the first time, are going to be able to deliver metrics to the industry, collecting exactly how many horse fatalities did we have in 2023, how many were training related, how many were on the racetrack, how many were musculoskeletal, how many weren't, what our sudden death looks like. And these are statistics that we will provide, even if it's painful, because we haven't done it before in this comprehensive manner. That is what we owe the industry, and we owe ultimately our communities, and that's what we're going to be doing. And we are optimistic that we are making sort of substantial steps forward and improvements, and that we're going to see that over time. We also are doing a lot with jockeys themselves. I mean, I saw that the human is potentially less of a concern to the public, but I think probably for all of us in this room, they are just as much a concern for the governing bodies. And so we have, truth is that research shows that the best way to keep a jockey safe is to keep the horse safe, because the risk of a jockey getting injured is substantially tied to the horse. But nonetheless, we've launched a number of programs, the first ever national concussion protocol for jockeys. We have an electronic medical record system that didn't exist before. We have a mental health program. So a number of things that we're trying to do to also sort of help in that regard, because today it's horses, but tomorrow it could be looking at other stakeholders in our sport. The last thing I want to really talk about is the anti-doping program. That was the second program that we launched. It was later than the racetrack safety just because of certain components of the statute that I won't bore you with. We launched that in May of 2023, actually after the Derby and after the Preakness, the Monday after the Preakness. It is, for the first time, a national uniform anti-doping program. We have 6 labs that are harmonized. We have, testing that is comprehensive. The thing that's really interesting about horse racing is that there were no parameters on what a test tested for. So, Texas could do something entirely different from Kentucky, and it was obviously driven significantly by how much you were paying for the test. So if you're paying, you could have 1,000 substances prohibited, but if you're only testing for 2, you weren't going to have a very successful program. So now in every state that we cover, it's the same menu of substances, the same levels, and our labs working very closely together. We appointed the Drug-Free Services International, Drug-Free Sport International, to run the anti-doping program for us. Under the law, we have to have an independent anti-doping agency to run the program. And so we appointed them back in March of 2022, and as I said, we launched in May of 2023. We have an advisory council, of which Sonia Keating is an important member, and others within the industry with regards to lab expertise and other areas. And so since we launched the anti-doping program, we've tested 60,000 horses in the last 6 months. We've prosecuted about 60 cases. The other thing that's really been a big step forward is that under the previous state system, these cases would actually go through the state court system. They wouldn't go to arbitration, which is typical in sport. And so you would have very significant time lags and a lot of inconsistency amongst the states. And so our average sort of from test analysis, from the sample being drawn to conclusion is 60 days with our cases. So we're really emphasizing, kind of swift adjudication. And the reason for that is, obviously we want efficiency, we want professionalism, but also, our program is focused on the clean trainer, like the 98% or 99% of trainers that compete within the rules. Our job is to protect them, to make sure that when they line up with their horse in the starting gate, that they're getting the most fair opportunity to win and to showcase their horse's talents. And so that is really what it's built around, and we think that having efficiencies and a quick adjudication is really important. So I'll end with this. Where does this all leave us? As David said, we're one community of horse lovers, and like it or not, we're linked together. When I was in horse sport, I would always sort of say, well, at least we're not racing, so I'm sorry that you are often linked to us, but we are doing our best, and I think you're going to see a lot of progress in the coming years. And so we need to stand together to educate the public. And I think we need to relentlessly tell the story of how the horse is really at the center of everything that we all do, that the respect for the animal is paramount, and that you can't find hardly a person in our industries that doesn't feel that way and hasn't dedicated so much of themselves to caring for the horse and developing the horse. But we do need to make it safer, whether it's racing, veterinary protocols and services, or whether it's training methods. We need to continue to make it safer. I often get asked the question, is it possible? We measure fatalities by starts. So last year we were at 1.25 per 1,000 starts, and we hope and expect that when our numbers come in, we'll be lower this year. But I often get asked the question, can you ever get that number to 0? And the truth is probably not, but what I say is we're gonna die trying. Like that's gonna always be our goal. We may not get there, and it may seem like a very difficult goal to attain, and it may very well be impossible. We are gonna continue to try to get to 0, because that's our responsibility. And then what I'll end on is that I do also often get asked the question, like, what does success look like for HISA? Like, what's your metric for success? And my answer to that is, when you're not talking about us anymore, when you're not talking about safety, when all the media reports on is that incredible race or that amazing show jumping competition, and it's just accepted and expected that the horses are safe, that they're being treated well, that there are no welfare issues, when we're no longer the story. And so with that, I want to end by saying the spotlight should be on the horses and the great stories, and not on safety and integrity issues. And I look forward to hopefully working with many of you over the years to continue to strive towards those goals. Thank you. And I'm happy to stay for questions if you want. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. There are comments or questions, and I'm going to lead off with one of them. And I think just it's interesting that how you have put data kind of at the forefront of trying to make decisions.
Yeah.
And that is the same thing that we found with the eventing thing, that we actually, when we started that, we didn't know what we were talking about. Yeah. And so data becomes a huge part of it, and knowing some of those things that you guys have supported here in the last year about starting to be able to track data, right? Because we don't have it. We don't have data of, let's say, falls. We have just started basically in the last couple of years about horse falls, or in all of the different things. We started with concussions, but now this year we're starting on just total falls, right? So just straight across the board. So again, a couple of years probably to get the data to be solid, so you can start to make decisions. But it's very, very important that from the data side to be able to make informed decisions and make sure that you're actually doing a decision that is going to make a difference, and not maybe an emotive decision that actually doesn't actually shift the needle far enough.
And it's also just a lot easier to get buy-in, because one of the biggest challenges we face in racing is, a lot of decisions that are made by veterinarians about whether a horse is fit to race or not fit to race, by definition, have to have some subjectivity, right? And so there's a lot of angst around, no, my horse is fine, or whatever. And so I think the more you can build in like objective metrics around these issues, the more you get kind of trust, I think, in the system. And I think if you sort of follow the data, you're really typically in a good spot.
Yeah, there was a question over here.
Thank you. A couple of questions. How many horses per 1,000 starts?
So in 2022, HISA's only started measuring in 2023, but the Jockey Club has been running something called the Equine Injury Database for a number of years. It is voluntary, but the participants really, I think, really do ethically put in their data. So for 2022, the Equine Injury Database showed 1.25 deaths per 1,000 starts.
And how many starts a day are they at the tracks, nation?
So it's really difficult to answer because it's very seasonal, right? So like you'll have a lot more in the summer than you do in the winter, et cetera. But a typical racetrack has a race card of 10 races a day with maybe 7-8 horses per race.
Times how many races in the United States on that day?
Oh God, I can't give you that. I can't do that math.
I'm just wondering, you say that number and it doesn't sound bad, but if it's every 3 days a horse dies on the track, then it sounds worse.
Yeah, no, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of races. So if you want to ask, like, what does that aggregate number look like? It's something, and by the way, that's a number that includes musculoskeletal, but also if it's related to a race and it's even a colic or it's a sudden death, if it's a heart-related issue, that is included in that number, just to be clear. But really where that gets us to and is about something like 600-700 a year probably in 2022, which is obviously not acceptable, but you're talking about something like 60,000 races, 80,000 races. I mean, it's thousands and thousands. I mean, because all these horses also, many of them are racing multiple times, so.
Right. And the next question
and just
I have.
One more thing, just to put it in context, sure, is that the UK is at about at 1.1, Japan's about at 0.9, and Hong Kong is about at 0.6. So those are our, we're trying to get closer and closer to our international.
Right.
Yeah.
The next question is, because I have clients that also have racehorses. Mm-hmm. They tell me that there's incentive money for trainers to enter their horses to fill races, and that it leads to trainers entering horses that are not ready.
So that is definitely something that, just take a step back. Those rules are basically track by track. Those are business-related rules, right? They're not rules that we regulate at HISA, and some of them have, like a Kentucky bred will get an additional, amount of money, or a Pennsylvania bred if you're in those jurisdictions. We do hear anecdotally that racing offices sometimes put pressure on owners and trainers to enter horses to fill races, and obviously that's something that we certainly don't want to see, and we're working hard to solve for. And part of it is about, there's a lot of racing in the U.S., and the foal crop has continued to drop over the years. And the question is, are we really operating at the right number of races, et cetera? And so these are all questions the industry is addressing. But the last thing in the world that we want is horses being entered just to fill races. And because our data does show, even what we have preliminarily, that the more kind of high-speed work that a horse has, the more it's at risk for injury and for breaking down. So that's something we definitely want to avoid.
Yep.
I also want to support Lisa. I come from the racetrack, and I am now in the sport horse industry.
Do that for the camera.
But also these horses that run, and when they're entered, and it's because of Lisa and our phenomenal veterinary staff, these horses have to be cleared by their attending veterinarian, their regulatory veterinarian, before they breeze every single time. They're also looked at several days in advance before they run. So for the racetracks that do put pressure on these horses to run, they are supported by veterinary staff. And without Lisa, some of the smaller tracks that operate differently, we are trying to make every racetrack, from Belmont to Emerald Downs to Turf Paradise, they all have the same entry protocol, and that these horses are looked at several times. These horses are looked at in the mornings. The regulatory vets are on the racetrack watching them train. They watch them come back. They watch them for bleeding. And now that it's become such a big point for our social licensing, other trainers are watching other trainers there's a lot of peer pressure now. So racing, I was in racing 30 years ago, and how it's changed in the last 30 years is monumental. So, and being in the sport horse industry, a lot of people don't support racing, but we all need to support racing because we all get those horses that when they're done racing, they come to us. And we don't have those horses to remake without the racing. So we all need to come together and support each other because we all benefit from the thoroughbred.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
You make one really good point I just want to underscore is that there are a tremendous amount of veterinary eyes that sort of scrutinize every horse before it's allowed to run. And so typically if there is any sort of pressure and there's a horse that shouldn't be running, we generally can catch that.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that all being in this together, what we're really trying to do is learn the best practices from each other. So best practices, some of the things that we do, that apply to racing, some of the best practices that racing is coming up with, just because your financial resources are a little bit bigger than ours in many different ways because of the government side. So, I think the study of the best practices between the two groups or any of the groups that we're in is actually the benefit that we're being here and not being on the critical side, especially because you're just finally put the whole thing together. Making it a nationwide thing instead of just a state-by-state thing is pretty huge. So I think the best practices side is what we're trying to
Gentleman here had a
support.
question, I think. Okay, yes, sir.
I'd like to pick up on Tracy's. I've been in the business about 60 years, and I want to thank you, Lisa, for changing the world in 2 years. 2 weeks have been pretty
2
2 weeks.
And I have an
This
amazing
lady
team.
single-handedly has done an excellent job of changing our business. And it's great because you're bringing the FEI and the NFL and the horse business. I can't tell you how much I appreciate, and stay tight.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right,
We
thank you,
appreciate
everyone.
really making the time to come and talk to us about it. So thanks. Good to see you again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you actually see on your tables there's some cards and pens there to please write down some comments or questions. We have another day tomorrow. Cammie is going to give a presentation about what the next generation or next iteration of where the FEI went with their commission, their worldwide commission. We have Dr. James Hurd coming in talking about habituation tomorrow afternoon and the ability for us to see, do we see it? Do we see anymore? So there are, as I said, there's some cards and pens in front of you to write down some thoughts. I'm going to ask you at the end of this to definitely write down some ideas of yours of where we go. So I really do thank you for joining us here in these couple days and helping us all, right? Everybody helps each other, as we've just heard. We have to help each other in this meeting, and so I hope it'll be a fruitful couple of days, because there's some serious topics swirling around that have different impacts on the future of equestrian sport. Though some of these issues are in faraway lands, I don't know if anybody has been following the Helgestrand thing in Denmark, and the effect that that's having in Europe. So some of these issues are happening in faraway lands, but realistically, there are no faraway lands anymore because of instant pictures and instant communication. The topics that we previously discussed here last January are becoming more intense, and we believe the time is now to start the necessary actions to preserve, yes, but also more importantly, promote equestrian activities here in the United States and all over the world. 20 years ago, that's a little hard to say, 20 years ago this weekend was the first annual meeting that we had for the USEF. It was a time to unite the sport horse world and work together. Now, 20 years later, that has become an idea that's held true, and it's even more important now than ever in the realm of horse welfare. All sports are impacted. All are equal in measure to the concepts brought by the outside of the horse industry. And today, all horse sports are being scrutinized. And no individual discipline or sport can have more impact on the future thoughts than all horse sports working collaboratively together can. Together, our voice is stronger. So this is the time, we believe, to stand for what we believe in. Though from different backgrounds and different interests within the horse world, we are all united in the belief that horses are good for humans, as long as humans are good for horses. And within that, we would have to admit that to be good for horses, that humans then have to be good to horses. What does that mean, though? We think that the physical and emotional needs need to be met. The idea of forage, friends, and freedom have to play in the everyday life of horses. In exchange for the horse performing these amazing athletic endeavors with a human partner, we need to keep our side of the bargain and provide a good life for horses. A life full of quality food, a life full of social bonds, and a life full of purpose. Kind of similar difference with slight differences to a good life for a person. However, we cannot make the mistake of thinking that horses in human emotional terms. They're different. They think differently, they have different priorities, they experience emotions in a different way. The unusual characteristic of the horse relationship is their ability to accept humans into their social needs. The willingness to have humans replace the instinctual social bonds that happen between horses and have that bond happen between a human and a horse. And I'm talking about the social bonds, not the physical sport partnerships. It's an awesome responsibility and one we humans should not take lightly so that we could avoid the irreparably damaging or even destroying that bond. The USEF becomes and is a central part of the future of the horse industry. It is a ship, and ships are hard to turn. But ships also provide stability and safety in turbulent times. Right now, the USEF has the authority over and therefore the impact on what happens in a competition ring, and a slightly smaller extent to what happens on the show ring as a whole. The quality of stabling, footing, and competition standards have risen in these last years. All expensive to provide, we all know, all absolutely necessary for the health of horses, athletes, and the sport itself. Someone does have to pay for those standards, and no, we can't go back to the past where those standards were not at a high level, not because of negligence, but perhaps because of ignorance or lack of technology. We've come a long way with materials and processes used to have these necessary basic blocks which form the foundation of the showing experience. Yes, there are many that grumble about the cost and complexity of showing, but when you take it apart, what would you let go? What would you stop? Biosecurity, which we heard so much about this morning, which if neglected could shut down an industry costing millions of dollars, which has happened. It happened in Europe, shut this twice, which is why those regulations through the FEI are so very, very strong now. Footing, risking the horse's longevity and the rider's safety, also a welfare and a monetary issue. So these are just a few of the examples of the changes that have happened in equestrian sport, and they've been a necessary evolution in equestrian sport. How would you let some of that go? Right? We can only go forward, right? We don't have that choice. We can only go forward. But we neglect a part of the equestrian sport that can and has had an impact on the welfare and social license side of the equation. The training practices at home and the training practices in the training and warm-up ring. We all know that the smartphone which is an oxymoron, has become a technology that can instantly spread images with or out of context that can damage the world as a whole. As what was said last year, everyone is a journalist now. Sometimes this use is malicious. Sometimes it's accidental. But all can have an impact. The training practices that put horses in physical pain must not be allowed to continue. The training practices that put the emotional side of the horses under extreme stress, they're harder to identify, but they've got to be addressed. So it's time to lead and not follow. It's time to take the role of establishing a philosophy for others in the equine industry to emulate. If we set an attitude, then others will have something to say that they can hold up to study. Without that leadership, the USEF can consider itself just another organization. I believe that we must take that leading role in the direction of animal partnerships. I would suggest that we cannot wait and take those ideas and processes from others, but we must be the standard bearer in the field. Peter Drucker said a great comment, the best way to predict the future is to create it. The USEF has stepped up into a leadership role in the world of horse welfare, and the USEF needs to continue to be comfortable with leading that concept. For example, as I talked about before, the U.S. Army reached out to us in their restructuring of the caissons platoon in Washington, D.C. It was a fruitful, very informative conversation both ways, and they have now asked us to be continually involved in what their restructuring of their process is. That's a classic example of the role that the Federation should and needs to play. So, now we're asking the affiliates who have the immediate feel for what's happening on the ground to become a larger part of the equine welfare process. And we already know that there's tremendous work going on done by officials and managers on the ground during a competition. But the questions are, and this is a question that we asked next door, do they have enough guidelines? Do they have enough tools? And does the USEF have enough tools? Those are questions that I believe need to be put out in front of the industry. Do we have enough tools to be able to have an effect on horse welfare as it goes forward? The program is if you see it, say it, comes to mind. Behind that concept, do we have the right tools to react there on the grounds? And then possibly a larger, stronger structure to make sure that we convey that we are committed to not only keep the competition standards, but also ensure that the training practices at a show, and if brought to the Federation at home, are those practices acceptable if it gets brought to us? A priority in the horse welfare environment. The USEF relies on us as individuals to be the eyes and ears for the benefit of the sport. Are we as individuals holding ourselves to high enough standards that we can be proud of? Are we holding ourselves and the individuals around us to that standard? And do we have enough to apply those standards to someone that is not reaching those aspirational levels? Do we agree on what those standards are in equine training? It's different. We know different from one side to the other, one affiliate to another, one sport to another. I think we can probably agree on some of the examples, right? Not using a whip in punishment, but using it as encouragement. As we heard with racing, anger-motivated actions, artificial equipment, pain-related equipment. I think these are things that we could agree with. How do we see it? How do we say it? Can we agree that roker or hyperflexion, English or Western, is a bad image and has a negative aspect on the physical side of the horse? Should equipment that is not allowed to be used in the show ring allowed in the training ring at a competition? These are just examples of what last year we called the underbelly of the sport. Again, I want to emphasize that we all agreed that this is not a predominant part of the sport, and in many ways is not an acceptable part of the sport, but it does exist and can be witnessed. or captured digitally, just as easy as the best of training practices can be captured. But we agree that this is a small side of what happens. I think that we can agree that these actions or methods are hugely damaging to all of the breeds and all of the disciplines. So it's time to lead and not follow. It's time to stand up and take some positions that come from you, to step into the present and future, knowing that we cherish the horse as a partner, that we thrive on their companionship, and that we fully realize that it must be a two-way street between our use of the horse in exchange for the horse's total and complete care in our hands, for our activities and our sport to be acceptable in the public eye. So the USEF this weekend is actually having a coaching conference in the office. They've just spent 3 days there. Part of their learning is that difference between being bored. I hope you're not too bored. Are you in your comfort zone? Are you stretched to outside your comfort zone? And then are you in panic zone? I hope the thought process is to take everybody to a place where we stretch them beyond their comfort zone and not put them into the place where they're in panic zone. That feeling of being able to go and think about it differently and thinking about it more, and not panic zone where the hand comes up and we stand behind the wall and we don't participate. So I hope that these ideas push that, but it has to come from within. It can't come from legislation. It can't come from outside organization. It has to come from within, which means it has to come from you. And so this is from within a bottom-up strategy of trying to make sure that the voice is heard, the concerns are heard, and then how can we do with them, and how do we balance it, and how do we do this with our sport? This is the idea. It has to come from you. We don't want it to come from somewhere else, or even, in some ways, we don't want it to come from the government. In this aspect, the USEF as a whole, thinking about the USEF as the office, right? We want to set a thought process, and please, we want you to be able to participate in because it has to come from within. So I'm going to ask you, you can talk about it in your tables if you would like, but please confidentially, important, confidentially write down some training practices, at least one practice that you feel is not good out in the sport to be able to internally from your own side or externally to be able to write down one that is not good for the training of these horses or represent a threat to the sport. Don't share them. Please keep them confidential. I'll come around and pick them up, and then hopefully maybe some of these conversations can start to happen in here, just not only in the next couple of days, but in the next, as we step into the future. That's what I'm asking for you to work for your food, is please write down confidentially on some of these cards what you think is something that is a training practice or a showing practice or something like that that you feel like is a threat if it is in the public environment, as in public, or something that could be captured digitally. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right, cool. Thank you. I'm just going to look at these later on and see maybe similarities, and then we'll, tomorrow afternoon when we talk about, when Dr. Hurd does his presentation, maybe some of these will come back up. But we'll just kind of see if there's more similarities in some things than others. Does anybody have any comments or questions at this point? A comment? Yep, sorry. Here, oh, I got a thing here. Sorry. I can't remember if this is on.
Biosecurity.
We
got that spray. Yeah, everybody's there's biosecurity stuff over there.
So just.
We haven't told everybody that. Please line up and we're going to spray all of you.
Oh, that's. Which will solve the microphone passing problem. So I had one question, two questions, kind of one comment. One is, I think we've been talking about social license, and I think it's really important that, and I've not been involved in every conversation, right? So like I think it's very important that there's an inward aspect of this. We have to take that responsibility to do the sport the right way, and I think we spent a lot of time talking about that today. The public does not recognize that or see that. They can see some of the results of that, but I've made this mistake in companies in crisis modes too. The story that you have to amplify out has to be like 7 times what the problem you're fixing for the public to understand what it is that you're doing with this. So I think the campaigns are not just about horse welfare. Like, you have to be really proactive, because in the absence of information, particularly with today's social media, people will put whatever information in that they want with it. And I feel really strongly that the benefits of horses go well beyond just the welfare piece, which we talked about today, we talked about in the general session. It is very clear that everybody knows this, but I think it's important that we put it out there in the public in a very big and bold way, which then gives you something to stand on as you police and correct and appropriately manage the sport from within. And so, I just wanted to.
No, I would totally agree. If I can comment, just at the beginning of last year, we had a lady named Sarah Kingsley here, who came out of the politics world, to tell you the truth, and gave a talk to many of us that are in there. How many of you guys were here last year? So we talked a lot about it, and her thing was about the positive stories of the human, not just the human-horse relationship, but just positive stories or like it, and those positive stories become the bedrock that you can stand on when something goes wrong, because it's going to go wrong, right? Lisa talked about getting to zero. I'm in a sport that in the end, you're right, our numbers have been going, from a risk management, we've made huge inroads on risk management, and very controversial over the last 20 years, extremely controversial to the guys that played the sport, and even back in my day, in the 1800s. But those stories, that's the bedrock that you stand on, right? In the end, because things are going to happen, right? They're just going to happen. I would totally, completely agree with you. That has to happen not just at the federation level, but it has to happen at the affiliate level. It has to happen at the show level, right? The show managers and the way that they talk about it. And it also then has to go down to the individual athletes, putting the stories that they have and their joy about what they do with the horses and putting that out there. There's absolutely no question. Because there's one thing we don't describe, because horses, doing a bit of media here and there, there's one thing that the horse people don't explain well enough, not defend it, but just explain well enough what we're doing, right? You go use a word like impulsion down to somebody out on TV, and they're like, what nuclear term was that? So, terminology is what I kind of said earlier about words matter, right? What words do we use? What emotive things that we use? Because as I said in my little speech there, I actually 100% believe, and I think most of you that know me, 100% believe that I actually think horses are really good for humans, not just the other way around. So the interesting thing about the horse side, in the 1920s, there were basically 23 million horses in the United States. Agriculture, military, everything. They were being used everywhere. In the 1950s, that went all the way down to 5.2 million. Right? And now there's a kind of a number that is out there between the American Horse Council and some other numbers, somewhere between 7.6 and 9.1 million horses. So the species is actually thriving in a way. And I actually personally, it's my personal belief, and I think, and I talk about it in this way quite a bit, that I actually think that the species is surviving and growing because of sport and recreation, not despite it. And I think that's a message. That's a message. Did you have another comment, or?
I was just gonna say, and I'm sure this is going on next door, but right, it has to be from everybody, right? Like, I think that's something that we in the industry and at the higher performance, right? There needs to be consequences if it's not followed. I think that, you know, we see at competitions, right, like people getting good scores, but knowing it's bad practices, and like it's got to be the whole organization, the judging, the officials, the people that are watching the warm-ups. Like, we have to stop turning the blind eye and doing this if we want to do it for real.
Yeah, I fully agree, and that's a little bit what I talked about. Do we have the tools? Actually, we are giving people the tools. Are we giving our officials the tools? Are we giving the managers the tools? Do we have enough tools within the system that we have by the time it gets up to the office? Are those the right tools? Because next door, they're talking about sometimes they don't feel like the USCF backs them up. I think there's a couple steps leading up to that before it ever gets to the USCF level. In my sport, we use a recorded warning. And it's the only reason it's recorded. And then there's no backlash off it unless if you get multiple ones, right? But the recorded is so that the next competition knows about it. Because they gave one, and now you did it again, your third time, now you're in trouble. But instead of just having a black and white system that you're either in trouble or you're not in trouble. So maybe there's right there, how could you break the cycle in that day that it is just hey, this is a warning, but it wants to be, we did it off of verbal first, right? But then the next group didn't know about it. So that's the only reason we're there. Yes.
The mindset change.
Yes.
It's not about being punitive and ruining it for everybody, but if you don't start changing the mindset, changing the words, changing the actions, then you'll never get to the other side.
Totally agree. Couldn't agree more. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to pick up on that because I think that's such an important point about, you know, the comment was made before, communication can't fix the problem, but I do think communications can be a huge part of helping, especially the external facing issues. And all of us are ambassadors of the sport, regardless of whatever seat we're sitting in. If we're putting in new footing in our barn or at a horse show, when we're talking about it on social media, mention the fact that that's because you want to have the best situation for your horses. If there's a horse ambulance at the horse show, shoot a picture and say, you know, happy to see they're here in case needed, but, you know, hope we don't need them. I think we shy away from things because we're afraid of sort of pointing out, ooh, you might need a horse ambulance. But the truth is there's a comfort level of knowing that there are safety measures in place. At my event, we had a new police chief, literally, there was a new chief in town, and he had a bunch of higher level requirements, including bag checks all over the place, and some police with long rifles that were roaming the grounds. And when we had to change from we already had a police presence for years, but now we have a very high profile one, I was concerned, but on the very first day, one of our exhibitors posted a picture of two police with their long rifles standing next to the horse smiling, and she posted a picture saying, whatever the horse's name was, has never been safer, and it went viral, and everyone had positive comments. And I think we need to use the opportunity to put things in a positive light, even though it could be daunting and it feels dangerous.
So I'm going to go back to the U.S. Army and say that the cavalry division needs to come back. So they'll love that. I completely agree. So there was a comment back in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, hi. So question, I was in the officials briefing earlier, and one of the things that came up, and it kind of goes along with your comment, is there was a fear of posting even positive things on social media because it could elicit, well, you might have had a bad experience or good experience, but my experience was bad, and so it's how can the USCF help educate people in a way to give tools to be brave in the fact that I mean it's scary to me that people are afraid to post something positive because it might elicit someone making a negative comment. So that's that. How does USCF?
I'm going to comment, and then I'm going to ask maybe Vicki to comment that Yeah, this is something that we talked about a little bit before, especially last year, where we talked about in social media, basically, if you have something that you're not going to send to your grandmother, right, don't send it. You know, I certainly know those people, and I have a 24-hour rule, right, so I'm not answering anybody, even by phone, so that you have time to think about it, right? Because that's the problem is that most of the social media things are emotive, right? They're doing it off an emotion and immediate reaction instead of thinking about it and putting it in perspective. And so the education of that straight across the board, I think, is huge. We've talked about it internally, you know, about how do we educate, which includes not just giving that opportunity, maybe using the Learning Center for competitors, but also then officials and also show managers and also commentators, right? Everybody straight across the board, not just one section of the sport. Vicki, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think in general, if you have a positive message, you should always put it out and not be afraid of the response. Because I think overall, people are going to feed off of something positive, and you'll always get some negative comments. That's the case. And I would just say if you ever have a question, you're unsure, you know, you can reach out at any time, and we'd be happy to weigh in and give you an opinion of whether we think there's a risk involved or you should go ahead and move forward with it. So I think sometimes collaborating on these things is the best way to go about it. If you're one person and you're not sure, I think that's the best thing to do. You know, we had issues years back where we would get really negative feedback on some of the high trotting horses, the high stepping horses, and we put a response out. You know, we made a statement, and we don't often do that. You know, we don't often respond to comments because it's not really a good thing to get in a back and forth. But we have done it a few times. We discuss it internally, and then we do it, and it really does help. And we have been through proactive messages, that's just one example, where we were able to really turn the tide on that, where, yes, we're careful about what the photos and video we post, but we don't get the same kind of responses that we did. So I think it does require being strategic about it and thinking about it, and sometimes taking a little bit of a risk and a little bit of the harder road to set the course correction. But I think most of these messages can be managed. And again, what we have to be really careful about is stopping the bad behaviors or the things that can get out there as much as we can. Because once they do get out there, that's, you know, not stuff we're putting out, but other people are putting out, and that's where the risk is.
There was one up at the front.
Up front, yep.
Right there.
Okay, a couple, great, yep, okay, Glenn?
I had an attention-getting telephone call some years back, and it was during one of our shows, and it was from a newspaper reporter, and said, "I just left your show, and I was looking at your list of show officials, and you had a schooling supervisor listed. Now, what is it your exhibitors are doing in the schooling ring that they have to be supervised for?" Well, I danced around right quick, and I said, well, we try to keep a level playing field, and we also have horse welfare rules that we want to ensure are abided by, and that was it. But I thought it was, for somebody that's not a horseman and they see something like that, it's like you were saying earlier, we have a lot of education to do.
Sure, but I think also it's easy to fall into a trap. There is a wonderful article right out now. No, it's a scientific, it's a paper, it's a peer-reviewed paper about the Grand National in England that Joe sent to me and a couple other people sent to me at the summit. It's a really wonderful article. And basically, where they said because there was a horse death there or a horse falling or, people, racing's kind of going through the same thing in England that they're going through here. And that's jump racing. And they were talking about the commentators really took it to the wrong level because they were talking about how the horses, care, they're treated like kings and they're like family. That was only one. But actually what was the issue was they were talking about from safety point of view, right? The protesters. It was a safety thing. And they didn't address that at all. So that's why I believe that listening is actually so important to have the communication that you open up the door and invite them into an environment when you can, right? To have that conversation. What are your concerns? And well, this is what, do you know this is what we're trying to do about it? And these are the next 3 steps that we think we can get done, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. I mean, we did that with Keith years ago with, when we first started a long time ago. So, yes.
So one of the questions I have, you've talked about, and I think it was nice having the HISA representative here, is that we have to take this as all equestrian sports. But one of the pieces is there are several equestrian sports who are a little bit less mainstream with these safety things that are not involved with USEF and not in the thoroughbred or the racing industry. Have you all tried to approach and thoughts on how to engage those? Because that still leaves us with a black eye in a lot of aspects.
There were quite a few that were invited here to have an open conversation in this type of thing. And they have, some of them have their own programs and all that kind of stuff, but I will say that we are actively reaching out to those other organizations and trying to, come on, sit in the table, right? Let's get out of here. I have a feeling, and my feeling in going now, having reached out to that and not accepting, they're not accepting this type of thing that I haven't given up, that in the end, all right, now we're just going to do this more of in a private environment first, right? Let's sit around a table. Let's meet somewhere, maybe on their grounds, you know, and start the conversation that way so that it's not such a big black and white scary thing. So I think the thing is, the next version of it is to try to get into their environment and then bring them hopefully into that it is a joint conversation, because it is a total joint conversation. There shouldn't be criticism going back to all of their sports, right? Sometimes you might have to hold up a mirror, but it's still their thing. So I think that conversation is really, really, really important for all of us. Totally agree.
Rob?
And racing actually has reached out a lot. I've actually done a lot of interviews for the Pollock report. Right? They keep calling, what do you want to talk about, and stuff like that. And they go down to it. And I think that's a real valuable, we never turn it down because I think it's a valuable outlet, right? From the racing, to step in, what are you guys doing? What are you guys doing? Right? And I think that's really important, that's what you're trying to turn the conversation is like, what are you guys doing about this? We all have the same problem. So what are you doing? What'd you do? What'd you do? I think that's the benefit.
Robert.
So, Rob?
Yeah, reverting a little bit, I got to say, Vicky's comments totally agree with. The more positive we get out there, flood the public with positivity, because inevitably if you don't, it's just going to be negative. Don't shield bad actors. I mean, I'm sorry, but if there's someone who we know, it's something I talked about in a previous career, previous industry, because a bad actor can make us all look bad. And then, one of the things I deal with a lot, I'm with the U.S. Eventing Association, we have local area chairmen, and I get a routine contact from area chairs saying, someone posted online this very negative thing, we disagree, we want to refute it. And my first comment is, well, where did they post it? And if they say, oh, on their site, I say, well, how many followers do they have? Inevitably, it's like, oh, 100. And how many, and now if they post it on your site, you do control. You have the control. So does this violate any sort of policies you have in place? So take a good hard look at that. And then the only thing I'll leave with is, because if you start reacting to every negative comment that's out there, and this is, I think, what Vicky's getting at, you give them more power. And you give the lie more power. So don't fall into that trap.
Thank you. It's just a bit of a comment. I think it's both a strength and a challenge that USEF has so many different breeds and disciplines, and there are different rules and requirements for each of them, which might mean different equipment standards and things like that, which can have different perceptions in the public eye. And I think it's really important that we have these face-to-face meetings and we can have these interactions and see where the disciplines are coming together so we can have a cohesive message.
Yes, well, David, you keep saying, and it's so important, is we're discussing all of this here, and we need tools. We need to define the tools and possibly even simplify them so that it's pretty straightforward and that it can filter down. We can put these concepts into action through, I know there's work being done on trainer certification, so trainers learn what it is that they need to be emphasizing with their students. If you hold a professional license in certain professions, you're often required to take a renewal exam, 1 or 2 years or so, and one of them is often a course in ethics. And so you're reminded, we're reminded when we take Safe Sport. And I said in the other meeting, perhaps we should have a Safe Sport questionnaire or just something very simple that won't take a lot of time or get people aggravated, but just do a simple, when you renew your membership, part of renewing your membership is you review an update guideline of what we're hoping and expecting for in all of these items that we have been talking about. So basically, coming up with the tools, and you know that the FEI has their own commission for its equinewellbeing.fei.org. And after the FEI General Assembly, then right after that was when the Helgestrand issue happened. And I saw on their website that you could reach out to them. And I did. And I said, we've discussed this whole well-being thing, and it's great, but what can be put into action regarding that? How do you put it into action with membership so that everyone reviews it, and even just goes through a particular questionnaire when they renew their membership?
Yeah, Cammie, I know is going to talk a lot about that Welfare Commission tomorrow. And it is kind of alluded to here a little bit about if somebody brings something to the Federation that is clearly outside the norm of training, right? Which is what the Helgestrand thing basically ended up being about. It went beyond the norm of training. Can we actually do anything about it? Right? Do we have anything to do about it? Right? So that the Danish Federation there and the German Federation did it with somebody else that was actually acquitted because of their rules, and they changed the rules. But in the end, do we actually have that scope? Do we have that right? And do we have that thought process? And again, that is something that is not that the USCF is going to show up to everybody's stables and do it. But what happens if somebody sent something to you, right, or into the office, and something got sent to the Federation, and it is clearly outside the bounds? Does the Federation have the strength to be, or the process to be able to do it? Now, I actually believe that they can, because the legal process is, hearings both ways. You got to say your part. So all of those things. I think that structure has been proven over the years. But I would have to say that I would be a believer that I think we should have that ability, right? Not we're hunting for it, but if somebody brings us something, we should have the ability to react in whatever form is appropriate, right? So after full investigation, right up and full due process of the legal system. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, David. There was, to your point before, Erin, I thought it was an excellent one. I just wanted to follow up. Obviously, there's a lot of horse activity, not within the USCF umbrella. The good news is we interact with a lot of it in a lot of different ways. Either directly, we sit on different committees and commissions and boards of a lot of these different organizations that, again, are not part of us. And I have found in the last 3 years the reasons that they're asking for our help on this, or asking us to participate in these things, because when it comes to horse welfare in particular, they're open to the conversations. That's the good news. So I've always worried with big problems that everyone tries to get everyone in the room, and you end up trying to boil the ocean, and it's impossible. But you got to lead, and the stuff that we've started to do, and there'll be action steps and whatnot, and that's how we change behavior over time. And I agree with just putting out as great a strong positive message as possible so people see how much the horses like what they're doing. We got to have more of that out than the negative stuff that gets put out there. But I think other places are starting to think about that, only because I've been involved with a few of them in particular, and they are looking at it, whether it's, there's a lot of Western organizations who are very appalled by the non-sanctioned horse and horse racing organizations, whether it's Saddlebreds or the NTRA or the Jockey Club, about the unsanctioned quarter horse racing that goes on in various places in the world, not just in the United States. I mean, it's a horrible thing, and it's a cultural thing in some places, and they all accept it. But, and that's already been written up in the Washington Post as a bad thing. So people are starting to crack down on that. There's sheriff's offices in certain parts of the country who are searching for those things now. So I think the good news is there's things, people want this, we all want it. I think we have to keep leading and lead by example and get good messages out. And I haven't found one that's adamantly against, one of these organizations adamantly against horse welfare. I don't think that's going to happen.
And been around it for a while, I think it's really, really important that you understand that when things, there is actually a culture that has to change, and then the technicality changes, right? But the culture changes, which is a lot of why these meetings and talking about it are like, it's a change of culture, and each individual discipline is going to be a little bit different. I mean, they're going to be a little different, right? But the culture change is huge, and then technicalities can happen. I know that going through the eventing thing that we went through with, actually, which started off of human accidents, not horse accidents. But then the same thing that's happened with racing, actually we fixed the horse problem, the human thing takes care of itself. So that was a huge culture change in our sport over the last 20 years. Any other comments? Great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. Tomorrow we are in the morning. No, are we in the morning? Sorry.
Yes.
I missed the time. Our first session is
9 a.m.
That's morning. That's morning. So Cammie will talk about the commission stuff and the questions about where the worldwide look of that culture change is going. And then in the afternoon, we talk a little bit about habituation. Maybe some of these cards will come up and some of these thought processes will come out. So, okay, thank you very much. We appreciate the evening.